The Vampire King accepted Sophia's charity meal out of curiosity, not hunger. Until the first taste hit his tongue and his fangs retracted for the first time in millennia. What she didn't know was that her grandmother's secret recipe contained herbs that could strip immortal powers, and now every supernatural creature in the city wanted her dead. Sophia's fingers cramped around the ladle as she served the last bowl of soup to a homeless veteran who always thanked her in Spanish, his weathered hands shaking as he accepted the warmth she offered. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in St. Catherine's soup kitchen, casting harsh shadows across the volunteer station where she'd been standing for 3 hours after finishing her cleaning shift at the downtown office complex. Her lower back ached from bending over desks and emptying trash cans, and before that, she'd pulled a double at Mel's Diner, where the coffee was bitter and the tips were worse. Emma was staying late at Mrs. Chen's apartment again, probably asleep on the couch with her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest, and Sophia's heart twisted thinking about the babysitting fee she couldn't really afford but couldn't do without. Rent was due in 3 days and she was $40 short, which meant another sleepless night calculating which bills could wait and which utilities she could risk losing. The kitchen around her smelled of industrial disinfectant and the lingering aroma of her grandmother's potato soup recipe, the one Isabella had taught her with careful instructions about the exact pinch of oregano and the way to slice the cilantro so fine it almost disappeared into the broth. Sophia had used ingredients from her own nearly empty pantry tonight because the shelter's donation supplies were running low, scraping together what little she had because feeding others felt like the only thing that made sense when her own world was falling apart. The other volunteers had already left, gathering their coats and car keys with the relieved expressions of people returning to warm homes and full refrigerators, leaving Sophia to finish the cleanup because she never minded staying late, and they all knew she needed the few extra dollars the kitchen supervisor sometimes slipped her for going above and beyond. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. She was wiping down the serving counter when the front door opened with a soft chime that seemed too delicate for the heavy glass and metal frame, and she looked up to see a man who didn't belong in a place like this. He was tall and pale in a way that suggested expensive skincare rather than malnutrition, wearing a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than Sophia made in 3 months. And his dark hair was styled with the kind of precision that spoke of personal barbers and weekly appointments. But it was his eyes that made her pause mid-wipe. Silver like polished steel, and ancient in a face that couldn't have been older than 35, watching her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how late it was and how alone they were in the building. He moved through the scattered tables and folding chairs with fluid grace, his expensive leather shoes silent on the linoleum floor. And when he reached the serving counter, he spoke in a voice like aged whiskey poured over silk. "I would like a meal," he said, not asked, with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance, and Sophia felt the strange urge to step aside even though she was the only one there to serve him. The other volunteers would have fallen over themselves to accommodate someone who looked like he could write a check that would keep the kitchen running for months, but Sophia had cleaned enough executive offices to recognize wealth when she saw it, and she'd served enough entitled customers at the diner to know that money didn't automatically make someone worthy of deference. "What's your name?" she asked, ladling the last of her grandmother's soup into a styrofoam bowl, because it was all she had left, and he was here asking for food, like everyone else who came through those doors. "Adrian," he said simply, offering nothing more, no last name or explanation for why someone who could clearly afford any restaurant in the city was standing in a soup kitchen at midnight. Sophia slid the bowl across the counter along with a plastic spoon and a napkin, watching as he studied the contents with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and apprehension flickering across his perfect features. The soup was simple, Just potatoes and onions simmered with the herbs Isabella had sworn by, cumin and oregano, and a touch of epazote that Sophia had found at the Mexican market on the other side of town. Ingredients that carried the memory of her grandmother's hands, guiding hers in their tiny kitchen when she was barely old enough to reach the stove. Adrian lifted the spoon to his lips with deliberate precision, and Sophia found herself holding her breath for no reason she could name, watching as he took that first taste and went completely still. His silver eyes widened in what looked like shock, his entire body rigid, as if he'd been struck by lightning, and for a moment, Sophia thought he was choking or having some kind of allergic reaction. But then she saw his face, saw something shift in his expression like a man remembering a dream he'd thought was lost forever. And when he looked at her again, there was wonder in his gaze, along with something else she couldn't identify. "This is," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard and setting the spoon down with trembling fingers that seemed strange on someone who carried himself with such control. "This is extraordinary," he finished quietly, and Sophia felt a flush of pride because her grandmother's recipes had always been special, even if she'd never understood exactly why Isabella had been so particular about the measurements and the timing and the way the herbs had to be stirred clockwise while whispering words that sounded like prayers. Adrian finished the entire bowl in silence while Sophia cleaned the kitchen around him, stealing glances at his profile and wondering about the sadness that seemed to radiate from him like cold air from an open refrigerator door. When he finally stood to leave, he reached into his coat and pulled out a money clip thick with hundreds, peeling off more bills than Sophia made in a week and placing them on the counter beside his empty bowl. "For the kitchen," he said, his voice rougher now, changed somehow, and Sophia wanted to protest that it was too much, but the words died in her throat because $40 of that money would cover her rent shortage and the rest would keep Emma fed for weeks. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, and Adrian nodded once before walking away, his footsteps still silent on the floor, as he disappeared through the front door and into the night, like he'd never been there at all. Sophia locked up the kitchen and walked the 6 blocks home through empty streets that felt different somehow, charged with possibility or danger, she couldn't tell which. Her apartment building rose before her like a concrete monument to urban decay, its broken security door propped open with a brick and graffiti covering the walls in languages she couldn't read. But it was home, and it was paid for, or would be, once she handed over Adrian's unexpected gift to her landlord in the morning. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs on legs that felt suddenly heavy, fumbling with her keys at the door of 4B, while thinking about silver eyes and the way a stranger's presence had made the mundane act of serving soup feel like something sacred. The door swung open at her touch, and Sophia's blood turned to ice, because she always locked it, had checked it twice before leaving for her shift at the kitchen, but now it hung loose on its hinges like an accusation. "Emma!" she called out, her voice cracking on her daughter's name as she stepped into the living room that looked exactly the same, except for the wrongness of the open door and the silence that pressed against her eardrums like water. The babysitter lived next door and would have called if there was a problem, but Mrs. Chen's apartment was dark and quiet when Sophia pounded on the door with shaking fists, calling out in English and the few words of Mandarin she'd picked up from their conversations about Emma's homework and her favorite cartoons. She ran back to her own apartment and searched every room even though she could see it all from the doorway, the tiny kitchen where she'd taught Emma to scramble eggs, the living room with its thrift store furniture and Emma's art supplies scattered across the coffee table, the single bedroom they shared with its twin beds, separated by a curtain Sophia had sewn from clearance fabric. The note was waiting on the kitchen table, written in elegant script on expensive paper that felt like silk between Sophia's trembling fingers, the words burning into her vision like brands. The cook must answer for her crimes against the natural order, it read in flowing handwriting that belonged in a museum display case. "Bring yourself to the Crimson Tower before dawn, or the child pays the price." Sophia's knees gave out and she collapsed into the plastic chair beside the table, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. with stories she'd always thought were just stories, tales of la brujeria and creatures that walked between worlds, warnings about gifts that could be curses, and recipes that carried power beyond mere nourishment. Isabella had fled Mexico as a young woman with nothing but her knowledge and her recipes, settling in this city and raising a family while keeping secrets that Sophia was only beginning to understand. The herbs in tonight's soup hadn't been just seasoning, had they? And Adrian hadn't been just a wealthy donor looking to ease his conscience with charity. Sophia pressed her face into her hands and tried to make sense of a world that had shifted beneath her feet like quicksand, where serving soup to a stranger could somehow be a crime against nature, and her 5-year-old daughter could be taken as payment for sins she didn't even know she'd committed. The Crimson Tower. She knew that name from downtown, the glass and steel monument that scraped the sky like a needle trying to puncture heaven itself, owned by some reclusive millionaire who never appeared in the society pages or charity galas that the wealthy used to launder their reputations. Dawn was still hours away, but already the edges of the sky were thinking about lightning, and Sophia had a choice to make that wasn't really a choice at all, because Emma was everything, and without her daughter, nothing else mattered, not the rent or the bills or the 3 jobs that barely kept them afloat in a city that chewed up people like them and spat out the bones. She changed into her one good dress, the black one she'd worn to job interviews and Emma's kindergarten graduation, and walked back out into the night with her grandmother's warnings ringing in her ears and the taste of fear sharp on her tongue like pennies or blood. The Crimson Tower stretched into the pre-dawn darkness like a spear of glass and steel thrust into the heart of the city, its windows reflecting the streetlights in patterns that reminded Sophia of eyes watching from impossible heights. She stood across the street in the shadow of a construction site, wearing the navy blue uniform she'd stolen from the laundry service that cleaned the office building where she worked nights, her hair pulled back under a baseball cap that smelled of industrial detergent and other people's sweat. The uniform fit well enough to pass casual inspection, and the ID badge clipped to her chest belonged to Maria Santos, a woman whose shift she'd covered twice when the woman's son was sick, though Sophia doubted Maria had ever imagined her identity would be borrowed for breaking into the most exclusive building in the financial district. The service entrance was exactly where she expected it to be, tucked around the side of the building between loading docks that serviced the restaurants and boutiques on the tower's ground floor, protected by the kind of electronic lock that looked impressive to civilians, but could be defeated by anyone who'd spent years cleaning offices and knew that security was often just an expensive illusion designed to make people feel safe. She'd learned to pick locks from Carlos, the night supervisor at her first cleaning job, who'd taught her that locked doors were just suggestions, when you knew which master keys opened everything, and had noticed that rich people's expensive security systems always included service bypasses for the army of invisible workers who kept their world running smoothly. The elevator that carried her to the upper floors was smaller than the ones used by residents and guests, designed for staff who weren't supposed to be seen or acknowledged, and Sophia rode it with the practiced invisibility she'd perfected over years of moving through spaces where her presence was simultaneously essential and unwanted. The 42nd floor was all marble and glass, and the kind of understated luxury that cost more per square foot than most people made in a year. But Sophia moved through it like she belonged there, because confidence was just another tool in the arsenal she'd developed for surviving in a world that tried to erase people like her. She found Emma in a room that looked like something from a fairy tale, all silk curtains and antique furniture and toys that probably cost more than Sophia's monthly salary, but her daughter was sitting in a chair by the window, looking small and scared despite the opulent surroundings. The man guarding her was tall and lean with the kind of pale skin that suggested he spent his time in expensive gyms rather than outdoor work. His dark hair pulled back in a style that was fashionable among men who had personal stylists, and his clothes cut from fabrics that whispered wealth with every movement. He looked up when Sophia entered, his green eyes sharp with intelligence and something else that made her skin crawl, and when he smiled his teeth were too white and too sharp to be entirely human. Kieran, he said, introducing himself with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to being feared, and Sophia noticed that he didn't move away from Emma's chair or make any gesture that suggested her daughter was free to leave. You must be the cook, he continued, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't place but that sounded expensive in the way that European finishing schools and old money produced, the woman who's caused so much trouble with her little soup kitchen adventure. Sophia stepped forward, every instinct screaming danger, but her love for Emma stronger than fear, and was about to demand her daughter's release when the air in the room seemed to change, becoming heavier and charged with the kind of electricity that preceded thunderstorms. Adrian entered through a door she hadn't noticed, moving with less of the fluid grace she remembered from the soup kitchen, his perfect features showing signs of exhaustion that made him look more human and somehow more dangerous at the same time. His silver eyes found hers immediately, and she felt that same jolt of recognition that had passed between them over a bowl of soup. But now it was complicated by anger and fear and the desperate love of a mother who would do anything to protect her child. He looked diminished somehow, as if the expensive suit he wore couldn't quite hide the fact that something fundamental about him had changed, but when he spoke his voice still carried the authority of someone who expected immediate obedience. Kieran, leave us, he said without taking his eyes off Sophia, and the other man hesitated for just a moment before bowing his head and exiting through the same hidden door, his departure so silent that Sophia wondered if he'd learned to move like that, or if it came naturally to whatever he was. Emma ran to her then, small arms wrapping around Sophia's waist with desperate strength, and she could feel her daughter trembling against her as she whispered reassurances in Spanish and English, while her own heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Adrian waited until they were alone before speaking again, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that was probably meant to look non-threatening, but only emphasized the predatory stillness that seemed to surround him like an invisible aura. You have questions, he said. And Sophia laughed because it was either that or scream, and she'd learned long ago that hysteria was a luxury she couldn't afford. I have a 5-year-old daughter who was kidnapped from her babysitter's apartment, she replied, keeping her voice level despite the rage that burned in her chest like acid, and a note that suggests I committed some kind of crime by serving soup to a stranger who looked hungry. Adrian nodded as if this was a reasonable response and gestured toward a set of chairs arranged near the window that offered a view of the city spreading out below them like a carpet of lights and possibilities. Sit, he said, please. And there was something in his tone that suggested the politeness wasn't entirely genuine, but wasn't entirely false either. The supernatural world has rules, he began once they were seated with Emma curled in Sophia's lap like a frightened kitten, laws that govern the interactions between different species and maintain the balance that keeps our existence secret from human knowledge. Your grandmother's recipes contain ingredients that affect creatures like me in ways that shouldn't be possible, ways that threaten the established order, and make you incredibly valuable to some factions and incredibly dangerous to others. He paused to run a hand through his dark hair, and Sophia noticed that his fingers shook slightly with what looked like exhaustion or illness, though she couldn't imagine what could make someone like him appear vulnerable. I am what your folklore would call a vampire, he continued, though the reality is more complex than your legends suggest. And I rule the Eastern Territories through a combination of strength, cunning, and the respect that comes from 3,000 years of existence. But your soup did something to me that has never happened before, something that has made me weaker while making me feel more alive than I have in centuries. And that contradiction has upset the careful balance of power that keeps our world stable. Sophia felt Emma's grip tighten around her waist and realized that her daughter was listening to every word with the kind of focused attention that suggested she understood more than a 5-year-old should. But then Emma had always been unusually perceptive, and maybe that sensitivity was another inheritance from Isabella's bloodline that Sophia was only beginning to comprehend. Other factions want to use you as a weapon, Adrian said. his silver eyes reflecting the city lights in patterns that reminded Sophia of stars or tears, to create substances that could weaken or kill vampire nobility and overthrow the current power structure. Some want to eliminate you entirely because they see your ability as an existential threat to our kind. But vampire law protects those under my direct guardianship, which is why I'm offering you a choice rather than simply taking what I need. Help me understand your family's magic, and I will protect both you and your daughter from those who would harm you. Refuse, and I cannot guarantee your safety from forces that are already mobilizing against you. Sophia looked down at Emma's dark hair and felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like lead. But she'd survived this long by being smart rather than brave, and she knew that cooperation was sometimes the only path forward when all the alternatives led to destruction. "But I want guarantees," she said, meeting Adrian's gaze with the steadiness she'd learned from facing down abusive customers and predatory bosses and landlords who thought single mothers were easy targets. "I want your word that Emma will never be used as leverage against me again, that she will be protected regardless of what happens between us, and that if I help you understand my grandmother's recipes, you will help us disappear when this is over, so we can live normal lives away from your supernatural politics." Adrian studied her for a long moment, and then reached into his jacket to withdraw a small silver knife that looked old enough to have been forged in medieval times, its blade reflecting the room's lights in ways that hurt to look at directly. "A blood oath," he said, offering her the handle while keeping his eyes locked on hers. "Bound by magic that will enforce the terms we agree upon regardless of our personal feelings or changing circumstances. But understand that such agreements work both ways, and betrayal of the terms will result in consequences that neither of us would survive." Sophia took the knife and felt the metal warm under her touch, as if it recognized something in her that she didn't recognize in herself, and when she drew the blade across her palm, the pain was sharp and immediate, but somehow cleaner than any hurt she'd ever felt before. Adrian did the same, his pale skin parting like silk under the silver edge, and when they clasped hands, the contact sent electricity racing up Sophia's arm and into her chest, where it settled around her heart like a living thing. She felt his memories flash through her mind in fragments too quick to understand, but too vivid to forget. Images of blood and beauty and centuries of loneliness that made her own struggles seem brief and manageable by comparison, while something in his expression suggested that he was experiencing her memories in return, seeing her life through her eyes and understanding the weight of responsibility that came with being Emma's entire world. The connection lasted only seconds, but felt like hours, and when it broke, they were both breathing hard and staring at each other with new knowledge that changed everything between them, though neither could have said exactly what they'd learned or why it mattered. Emma looked up at both of them with eyes that were far too knowing for her age, and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she could feel something different in the air now, something that tasted like promises and tasted like home. The estate sprawled across 50 acres of carefully manicured grounds that looked like something from a European postcard, all rolling hills and ancient oak trees and gardens that bloomed in impossible profusion despite the late autumn chill that had settled over the countryside like a benediction. The mansion itself was built from honey-colored stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, its windows tall and graceful, and filled with glass so old it rippled like water when you looked through it at just the right angle. And Emma pressed her face against the car window as they approached, her breath fogging the glass, while she pointed out topiary animals and fountain sculptures that seemed too whimsical for someone as serious as Adrian to have chosen for his private retreat. The iron gates that guarded the entrance were wrought with symbols Sophia didn't recognize, but that made her skin prickle when she looked at them too directly, and she could feel something humming in the air around the property, like electricity or magic, or the kind of power that came from having enough money to reshape the world according to your preferences. Adrian sat beside her in the back seat of the black sedan, His silver eyes focused on something outside the window that she couldn't see, and she noticed that he looked stronger here on his own territory, as if proximity to familiar ground was feeding energy back into his diminished reserves. Emma had spent the entire drive asking questions about the estate and its staff, and whether there were horses to ride and secret passages to explore, her 5-year-old resilience already adapting to circumstances that would have broken most adults, and Adrian had answered each inquiry with the kind of patient attention that suggested he wasn't accustomed to children but was making an effort to understand this small person who had suddenly become his responsibility. The staff who greeted them at the front entrance moved with the same fluid grace that characterized Adrian himself, their pale skin and sharp features suggesting that employment in this household came with requirements that had nothing to do with previous work experience or references from former employers. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, was a tall woman with silver hair and eyes like chips of winter sky, who welcomed Emma with the kind of formal courtesy usually reserved for visiting dignitaries, and within minutes had organized tours of the library and the conservatory and the kitchen gardens, where herbs grew in patterns that reminded Sophia uncomfortably of her grandmother's carefully tended plots. Emma took to the place with the fearless curiosity that had always characterized her approach to new situations, befriending the gardener who spoke to plants in what sounded like ancient Latin, and the cook who let her help prepare meals that contained ingredients Sophia had never heard of, but that smelled like comfort and safety and home. Adrian's study became their meeting place each evening, a room lined with books in languages that predated most modern nations, and filled with artifacts that looked like they belonged in museums rather than private collections. And it was there that Sophia began learning the complex etiquette that governed interactions between supernatural creatures and the delicate political alliances that kept their world from descending into open warfare. The Eastern Territories comprised 17 major cities and countless smaller settlements, all bound together by treaties and blood oaths, and the kind of feudal loyalty that had been obsolete in human society for centuries, but apparently thrived among immortal beings who had time to hold grudges across millennia. Adrian ruled through a combination of strength and diplomacy, maintaining control over vampire covens and werewolf packs and witch circles that would have torn each other apart without his iron-fisted peacekeeping. But Sophia could see that his authority was built on the assumption of his invincibility, and that his current weakness was creating cracks in the foundation of power that had kept the territories stable for longer than recorded human history. She found herself cooking for him each night, recreating her grandmother's recipes from memory, and improvising when she couldn't remember exact measurements or techniques. And each meal seemed to restore some small measure of his strength while doing something strange and wonderful to her own sense of self, as if feeding him was feeding some part of her soul that had been starving without her knowledge. The kitchen at the estate was like something from a fairy tale, all copper pots and marble countertops and herbs hanging from the ceiling in bundles that released their fragrances when she brushed against them, and she discovered that cooking here felt different than it had in her cramped apartment or the institutional kitchen at St. Catherine's, as if the very air was charged with possibility and the ingredients responded to her touch with eagerness rather than mere chemical reaction. Adrian would sit at the small table by the window and watch her work with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. And during those quiet hours, she began to see glimpses of the man he might have been, before immortality changed him into something else. Someone who had loved poetry and music and the simple pleasure of watching sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He told her stories while she cooked, fragments of history that weren't in any textbook, about civilizations that had risen and fallen while he watched from the shadows and wars that had been fought for reasons that seemed meaningless after enough centuries had passed to blur the details into irrelevance. She learned that he had been turned during the Bronze Age collapse when the world was ending and civilization was falling apart around him, that he had spent his first century of immortality trying to save what could be saved before realizing that destruction and renewal were part of some larger pattern that repeated itself regardless of intervention. He had built his power slowly and carefully, gathering other vampires under his protection and establishing the territories as a safe haven for supernatural creatures who might otherwise have been hunted to extinction by humans who feared what they couldn't understand. But the cost had been his humanity and his capacity for the kind of love that made mortality bearable despite its brevity. Sophia found herself looking forward to these evening conversations as much as Emma looked forward to her daily adventures in the gardens and conservatory, and she began to understand that loneliness was the true curse of immortality, that living forever meant watching everything you cared about crumble to dust while you remained unchanged and unchanging. The attack came on their sixth night at the estate, just after Emma had fallen asleep in the enormous four-poster bed that made her look even smaller than usual, and Sophia was in the kitchen preparing Adrian's dinner when she heard the sound of breaking glass from somewhere on the ground floor. The estate's security system began screaming electronic warnings, while emergency lights bathed everything in harsh red illumination, and Sophia grabbed the largest knife from the block on the counter, because it was the only weapon within reach, and her maternal instincts were stronger than her common sense. Adrian appeared in the kitchen doorway with inhuman speed, his face transformed by fury, and something else that made his features sharper and more predatory than she had ever seen them. And when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that bypassed rational thought and went straight to some primal part of her brain that recognized the presence of an apex predator. Werewolves, he said, the word carrying enough contempt to fill libraries, and Sophia could smell something wild and animal and wrong drifting through the house like smoke from a fire that consumed more than just wood and fabric. Take Emma to the safe room, he continued, handing her a key that felt warm against her palm, third floor, behind the painting of the woman in blue. And don't come out until I come for you personally. She ran through corridors that echoed with sounds of battle, past windows that showed enormous shapes moving across the grounds with predatory grace, and found Emma already awake and alert in her bedroom, as if some instinct had warned her of danger even in sleep. The safe room was exactly where Adrian had said it would be, hidden behind a portrait of a Renaissance woman whose painted eyes seemed to follow them as Sophia pressed the key into a lock that was invisible until it clicked open, and the space beyond was lined with steel and stone and symbols that hurt to look at directly. Emma curled against her side without asking questions, her small body trembling, but her dark eyes bright with the kind of courage that came from trusting the adults in her life to handle whatever threatened their safety. And through the reinforced walls, they could hear sounds that belonged in nightmares rather than waking life, howls that spoke of hunger and violence and the kind of rage that could only be satisfied by blood and suffering. The battle seemed to last hours, but probably took less than 20 minutes, and when Adrian finally appeared at the safe room door, his expensive clothes were torn and stained with dark liquid that could have been blood or something worse, his perfect features marked by scratches that were already healing as Sophia watched. He moved carefully, favoring his left side in a way that suggested serious injury despite his supernatural healing abilities, and when Emma ran to him, he caught her with arms that shook from more than just exhaustion. One of the wolves got past the outer defenses, he explained, his voice rougher than usual as he carried Emma back toward the main house, while Sophia followed close behind. And it took 3 of my people to bring him down before he could reach the house. They were after you specifically, which means someone gave them detailed intelligence about the estate's layout and security measures, information that only a handful of people should have possessed. Sophia felt cold dread settling in her stomach like ice water, because she was beginning to understand that their sanctuary had been compromised from within, that someone Adrian trusted had betrayed them all. And as they walked through rooms that showed evidence of supernatural violence, she realized that the price of safety in this world was constant vigilance, and that love was a luxury that made everyone vulnerable. Adrian's injuries were worse than he had admitted, deep gashes across his ribs and back that weren't healing as quickly as they should have, And when Sophia insisted on cleaning the wounds, she discovered that her touch seemed to accelerate the process, her hands growing warm as damaged tissue knitted itself back together under her fingertips. The sensation was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, as if something inside her was reaching out to something inside him, and when he turned to thank her, their faces were close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his silver eyes and feel his breath against her lips. The kiss happened without conscious decision, a collision of need and gratitude, and something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. And the moment their lips touched, Sophia felt electricity race through every nerve ending, while visions flooded her mind of century upon century of loneliness and responsibility and the crushing weight of immortal existence. She saw every vampire Adrian had ever created, felt their deaths like wounds in her own heart, understood for the first time that ruling meant being responsible for the lives and safety of thousands of creatures who depended on his strength and wisdom and willingness to make decisions that would haunt him for eternity. When they broke apart, they were both shaking, and Adrian's eyes held wonder and terror and something that looked like hope struggling to be born despite centuries of disappointment and loss. The messenger arrived at dawn, a pale young woman with eyes like winter frost, who delivered her ultimatum with the kind of formal courtesy that made threats sound like invitations to tea. Marcus Thorne, she announced, standing in the estate's marble foyer, while Adrian's household staff gathered in a semicircle that suggested both protection and barely contained violence, requests the honor of your presence at a parley to discuss terms for the peaceful resolution of current hostilities. The words were civilized, but the meaning underneath was clear enough that even Emma, peering around Sophia's legs from the safety of the staircase, seemed to understand that something terrible was approaching their temporary sanctuary with the inevitability of storm clouds gathering on a summer afternoon. Adrian received the message with the kind of stillness that Sophia had learned to recognize as his most dangerous mood, his silver eyes reflecting nothing while his mind calculated odds and strategies and the cost of various forms of violence, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 millennia spent making decisions that other creatures would live or die by. Tell your master that I will meet him at sunset in the Meridian Gardens, he said, naming a public park that Sophia knew from her evening walks with Emma, a place of fountains and walking paths where families gathered on weekends and where the presence of innocent civilians would theoretically prevent the kind of supernatural warfare that could expose their hidden world to human scrutiny. The messenger bowed with fluid grace and departed as silently as she had arrived, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension so thick it seemed to press against Sophia's skin like humidity before a thunderstorm, and she found herself holding Emma closer while her mind raced through possibilities, none of which seemed to end with anything resembling safety or peace. The Meridian Gardens at sunset looked exactly as they always had, families packing up picnic baskets while joggers completed their evening circuits and elderly couples fed breadcrumbs to ducks that gathered hopefully at the pond's edge. But Sophia could feel wrongness in the air, like electricity before lightning strikes, a charge that made her teeth ache and her grandmother's pendant grow warm against her chest. Marcus Thorne stood beside the central fountain with an entourage that made Adrian's small group look pathetically outnumbered, creatures that moved with predatory grace and wore their supernatural nature like expensive clothing, confident and beautiful and absolutely terrifying in their casual display of power that could reshape the world according to their collective will. Marcus himself was everything Adrian was not, golden where Adrian was dark, warm where Adrian was cold, beautiful in the way that Renaissance sculptures were beautiful, all perfect proportions and classical features that suggested divine favor, rather than the harsh pragmatism of survival across impossible spans of time. When he smiled, which he did often during their conversation, Sophia could see fangs that were longer and sharper than Adrian's, canines designed for tearing rather than the neat punctures that Adrian's more civilized approach to feeding would require. and his eyes held the kind of madness that came from having nothing left to lose and everything to gain from watching the world burn. The negotiations, if they could be called that, were conducted with the elaborate courtesy that seemed to characterize all supernatural interactions, layers of meaning hidden beneath polite phrases and formal address that reminded Sophia of the way her grandmother had spoken to certain neighbors, all surface civility covering deep wells of mutual distrust and barely contained hostility. Marcus had assembled what he called a coalition of the willing, rebel vampires who chafed under Adrian's rule, and werewolf packs who resented vampire authority, and witch covens who remembered older ways of organizing power that didn't require them to bow before immortal kings who had never bothered to understand the complexities of magic that drew its strength from earth and moon and the turning of seasons rather than the consumption of blood and fear. He offered Sophia a choice that wasn't really a choice, though he presented it with the kind of reasonable tone that made his proposal sound like an opportunity rather than a threat to everything she held dear. "Join our revolution," he said, his golden eyes fixed on her face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading human expressions for signs of weakness or deception, "and help us create weapons that will level the playing field between the supernatural aristocracy and those who have lived under their boot heels for centuries. Your family's gift could free thousands of creatures from the tyranny of bloodline privilege and accident of birth, could create a world where power comes from merit and wisdom, rather than the simple fact of having survived long enough to accumulate territory and servants, and the kind of wealth that turns mortals into pets and playthings. The alternative," he continued when Sophia remained silent, "is that your daughter dies slowly, while our armies tear apart the city you call home. Collateral damage in a war that your refusal to cooperate will make both inevitable and devastating." Adrian stepped forward then, his hand finding Sophia's elbow in a gesture that was both protective and possessive, and when he spoke his voice carried harmonics that made several of Marcus's followers step backward despite themselves. "You forget yourself," he said, the words carefully modulated, but carrying enough threat to make the air around them shimmer with potential violence. "And the woman is under my protection, which makes your threats an act of war rather than diplomacy. Perhaps we should relocate this discussion to more private grounds where the constraints of human witnesses won't prevent us from resolving our differences in the traditional manner." Marcus laughed, a sound like silver bells mixed with breaking glass, and Sophia realized that he had been hoping for exactly this response, that goading Adrian into abandoning negotiation in favor of violence had been his goal from the beginning, because it would paint the established order as the aggressor rather than the defender in whatever propaganda war was already being fought in supernatural communities across the continent. But Sophia had spent too many years navigating situations where powerful men tried to make decisions about her life without consulting her preferences or considering her autonomy, and she stepped forward before either vampire could escalate their posturing into actual bloodshed. "No," she said, her voice carrying across the garden with surprising authority, and both immortal creatures turned to stare at her as if they had forgotten she was capable of independent thought, rather than simply being a prize to be won or a weapon to be wielded. "I won't be running away to hide in some foreign territory while people die because of powers I inherited without understanding them, and I won't be creating weapons for a revolution that would replace one form of tyranny with another. But I also won't stand by and watch innocents suffer, because ancient creatures can't find better ways to resolve their political differences than through war and murder, and the kind of wholesale destruction that treats mortal lives as acceptable losses in immortal games." She paused to look around the garden, at the families still visible in the distance, and the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, and felt the weight of her grandmother's legacy settling on her shoulders like a mantle she was finally ready to wear. "There are laws older than your kingdoms," she continued, addressing both vampires with the kind of steady confidence that came from understanding her own power for the first time. "Traditions that predate your political structures and bind all supernatural creatures regardless of their species or allegiance. I claim the right of formal challenge under the ancient accords, single combat between champions with the leadership of both factions, bound by the outcome, and the losing side's ruler, facing execution as penalty for their defeat. The silence that followed her declaration stretched long enough for stars to become visible overhead, and Sophia could feel supernatural creatures throughout the garden processing the implications of what she had just proposed, the risks and opportunities and potential consequences of subjecting their political future to the outcome of ritualized violence, rather than the kind of open warfare that would inevitably spill over into human awareness and force their hidden world into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Marcus recovered first, his golden eyes bright with something that might have been respect or might have been hunger for the chaos that such a challenge would inevitably create regardless of its outcome. Interesting, he said, his voice carrying new notes of calculation and barely contained excitement. And I accept your proposal provided that you serve as champion for our side, using your inherited abilities to prove that the old order has become vulnerable to change, and that power built on accident of birth and longevity can be overcome by those with the courage to fight for something better. But Sophia shook her head, her grandmother's pendant growing warmer against her chest, as if responding to her growing understanding of the choice she was about to make. I will serve as champion for the existing order, she said, feeling Adrian's shock like a physical blow even as Marcus's followers stirred with confusion and growing anger, because revolution without wisdom is just destruction wearing a prettier name, and I've learned enough about both sides to know that Adrian's rule, however flawed, has kept this city and its people safer than they would be under the kind of leadership that thinks violence is the solution to every political problem. The challenge was formally accepted under laws so old that their exact origins were lost to history, binding agreements that would be enforced by magic itself rather than any earthly authority. And as the supernatural creatures dispersed to prepare for combat that would determine the future of their world, Sophia found herself wondering if her grandmother had foreseen this moment when she taught a young girl to cook with herbs that carried power beyond simple nourishment. The ancient amphitheater beneath the city was older than Rome, carved from living rock by creatures whose names had been forgotten before humans learned to write. And accessing it required knowledge of passages that existed in the spaces between subway tunnels and sewer systems, and the forgotten infrastructure of urban development that had built over and around the bones of earlier civilizations. Adrian led them through maintenance corridors and abandoned stations that predated the current transit system, past walls covered in symbols that predated written language, and down staircases worn smooth by countless feet over millennia of use by creatures who conducted their most important business away from human observation. Sophia had trained for 3 weeks in the estate's gymnasium, learning to move with supernatural speed and strength that her bloodline made possible when properly awakened, practicing with weapons that felt familiar in her hands, despite having never touched them before. As if muscle memory passed down through generations was finally being allowed to surface. Emma had proven invaluable during the training, her inherited sensitivity allowing her to read the emotional states of sparring partners and provide tactical advice that helped Sophia understand how to use her opponent's expectations against them, how to appear weak while gathering strength, and how to turn apparent disadvantage into unexpected victory. Adrian's mortality had progressed to the point where he tired easily and required regular feeding just to maintain basic functions, his immortal strength fading in direct proportion to the deepening of his emotional connection to Sophia. And the terror in his eyes when he looked at her had nothing to do with fear of his own death, and everything to do with the possibility of losing her before they had time to explore what was growing between them. The amphitheater filled with supernatural creatures from across the continent, werewolves and vampires and witches, and stranger things that had no names in human languages, all gathering to witness combat that would determine the shape of their world for centuries to come. Marcus had chosen Cain, the werewolf alpha whose pack had attacked the estate, as his champion, a creature of such physical power that his human form could barely contain the violence that lived beneath his skin like barely banked fire. The rules were simple and absolute: combat until death or surrender with no quarter given and no mercy expected. The losing faction's leader to be executed immediately after their champion's defeat. And as the blood moon reached its zenith, Sophia stepped into the sand-covered arena, wearing her grandmother's pendant and carrying knowledge that felt both ancient and newly born, ready to fight for a future that honored both tradition and change. The arena sand beneath Sophia's feet felt ancient and consecrated, worn smooth by millennia of supernatural blood and sacrifice. And as Cain began his transformation from human to werewolf, she felt her grandmother's pendant growing hot against her skin, as if responding to some primal magic that predated the careful civilizations both sides claimed to defend. The alpha's bones cracked and elongated with sounds like breaking timber, while his skin stretched and split to accommodate muscles that doubled and tripled in mass, his face extending into a muzzle filled with fangs designed for crushing bone and tearing flesh from living prey. And the smell that rolled off his changing body was wild and feral and completely alien to anything Sophia had ever encountered in her carefully ordered human existence. But when their eyes met across the blood-soaked sand, something unexpected happened. A jolt of recognition that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to some deeper level of understanding that existed in the spaces between heartbeats and the silence between words. Suddenly, she wasn't standing in an underground arena surrounded by supernatural creatures baying for blood and violence, but instead found herself in a sun-drenched kitchen that smelled of cilantro and cumin and the kind of love that could only be expressed through food prepared with hands that understood the sacred nature of nourishment. Isabella Santos, her grandmother, stood at the stove stirring a pot that bubbled with liquid the color of twilight while speaking words in a language that sounded like Spanish, but carried harmonics that belonged to older tongues. And when she turned to face her granddaughter, her dark eyes held the weight of centuries and the wisdom that came from serving as a bridge between worlds that were never meant to be separate. The vision expanded and deepened until Sophia could see the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of family stories and childhood memories. The reality that her grandmother had been the last keeper of something called the Ancient Compact, a treaty between human and supernatural communities that had maintained the delicate balance of power for longer than recorded history. The herbs that Isabella had grown in her careful gardens weren't weapons against vampires, but medicine for creatures who had forgotten what it meant to be connected to the natural world, who had traded their humanity for power and immortality and found themselves slowly going mad from the isolation that came with outliving everything they had ever loved or cared about. The recipes that had been passed down through generations of Santos women were designed to restore what immortality eroded, to remind vampires of the joy they had once found in simple pleasures, like the taste of food or the warmth of sunlight on their skin, or the comfort that came from being truly known by another soul rather than merely feared or obeyed. Adrian's transformation after eating her soup hadn't been accidental weakness, but the beginning of a prophesied change, his body and spirit preparing for a role that ancient seers had foreseen, a vampire king who would bridge the gap between human and supernatural worlds, not through conquest, but through the kind of love that transformed both parties and made them stronger together than they could ever be apart. The vision shattered as Cain's massive paw swept toward her head with enough force to crush human bone like eggshell. But Sophia found herself moving with speed and grace that belonged to her bloodline rather than her personal experience, ducking under the strike while her hands found the ritual knife that had appeared at her belt, as if summoned by need rather than conscious intent. The blade sang through the air with a sound like church bells and struck the werewolf's flank, drawing blood that hissed and steamed when it touched the consecrated sand. And Cain howled with pain, and something that might have been relief, as the enchanted steel reminded his transformed body of its connection to reason and choice, rather than pure animal instinct. But before Sophia could press her advantage, the entire nature of the conflict changed, as Cain suddenly spun away from her and launched himself at Marcus, with the kind of fury that spoke of personal betrayal and long suppressed rage, his massive jaws closing around the vampire lord's throat, while supernatural creatures throughout the amphitheater roared with confusion and growing panic. Marcus managed to tear himself free with strength that spoke of his ancient bloodline, golden ichor streaming from wounds that should have been instantly fatal. And when he spoke, his voice carried new harmonics that made Sophia's teeth ache and her vision blur around the edges. "You fools," he said, his perfect features twisted with contempt, and something that looked like genuine fear. "You think this rebellion was my idea? That I gathered armies and plotted revolution because of personal ambition or political ideology? The truth is that I've been nothing but a puppet dancing to the whims of creatures so old and powerful that your modern kingdoms are like sandcastles built by children on beaches that will be swept clean by the next tide." The shadows around the arena's edges began moving with purpose rather than random motion, and Sophia realized that what she had taken for empty darkness was actually filled with watchers who had been present all along, ancient vampires whose age made Marcus look like a newborn, and Adrian seem barely more than a mortal child playing at immortality. They emerged from their hiding places with movements that defied physics and common sense, creatures who had walked the earth when humans were barely more than clever apes, and who remembered the taste of blood from the first civilizations that had dared to challenge the natural order by building cities and laws, and the kind of organized society that threatened the pure predator-prey relationship that these ancients considered the only honest interaction between their kind and lesser beings. Their leader was something that might once have been female, but had transcended gender along with every other human category. Her features sharp and predatory and beautiful in the way that avalanches were beautiful. All terrible power and inevitable destruction wearing a face that promised ecstasy even as it delivered annihilation. She spoke in a voice like wind through bone chimes, words that bypassed human language entirely and went straight to the primitive brain centers that recognized the presence of something that existed at the top of every possible food chain. "The compact is broken," she announced to the assembled supernatural creatures, her words carrying across the amphitheater with supernatural clarity. "And the time has come to return to the proper order of things, when our kind ruled through strength rather than negotiation, and humans knew their place as cattle rather than pretending to partnership with their betters. The modern kingdoms, with their treaties and territorial agreements and careful balance of power, are abominations that have weakened us all, turning apex predators into politicians and reducing the hunt to the pathetic charade of civilized feeding that your current leaders call governance." Cain shifted back to human form with the fluid grace that characterized all supernatural transformations, his naked body bearing ritual scars that spoke of werewolf honor codes and binding oaths that superseded personal preference or survival instinct. "I couldn't act against them directly," he said, his voice rough with emotion, and the kind of rage that came from being forced to serve masters whose goals violated everything he believed in, "because they bound me with magic older than pack law, older than the compact itself, spells that would have destroyed my entire bloodline if I had revealed their manipulation before supernatural law allowed me to choose my own path. But the challenge creates neutral ground where all previous obligations are suspended, where I can finally tell the truth about who has really been pulling the strings and why Marcus's rebellion was always intended to fail in exactly the way that would justify their return to open rule." The arena erupted into chaos as ancient vampires poured from hidden entrances, while werewolves and witches and younger vampires tried to form defensive positions against enemies who moved too fast to track and struck with power that belonged to a time when subtlety and restraint were unknown concepts among their kind. Adrian appeared at Sophia's side with movements that were still somehow graceful despite his increasing mortality, his silver eyes reflecting the kind of grim determination that came from understanding that everything he had built over 3 millennia was about to be swept away unless they could find some way to turn the tide of a battle that had been planned and orchestrated by creatures who thought in terms of geological time rather than the brief spans that characterized individual mortal or immortal lives. Emma's voice cut through the sounds of supernatural warfare with the clarity that belonged to childhood innocence and inherited magical sensitivity, her small figure somehow visible despite the chaos as she stood at the arena's edge beside Mrs. Blackwood and the other estate staff who had risked everything to bring her here against Adrian's explicit orders. "Mama," she called, her 5-year-old voice carrying supernatural harmonics that made every creature in the amphitheater pause and turn toward her. "You have to choose now, before it's too late, between keeping Papa human and letting him be strong enough to protect everyone." But it's not really a choice because Grandmama's recipes don't make you pick one thing or the other. They help people become what they were always supposed to be if the world hadn't gotten broken somewhere along the way. Sophia felt understanding bloom in her mind, like sunrise after the longest night. Comprehension of what her bloodline magic could really accomplish if she was brave enough to trust in powers that had been sleeping in her genes for generations, waiting for exactly this moment and exactly this choice. The ritual knife in her hand grew warm and began glowing with light that belonged to neither vampire magic nor werewolf strength, nor witch spells, but something older and more fundamental, the power that had created the original compact between species, and that could create something entirely new if she was willing to sacrifice her mortality, not to become a vampire, but to become something that had never existed before. A bridge between worlds that could hold supernatural power and human compassion in perfect balance. Adrian's eyes widened as he understood what she was proposing. The transformation that would bind them together across eternity, while creating a new form of existence that combined the best aspects of human and vampire nature, without the weaknesses that made each species vulnerable to corruption and isolation, and the kind of power that inevitably turned love into possession and protection into control. The ancient vampires were advancing through the chaos with predatory patience, clearly confident that the outcome of this battle was already decided, regardless of how much resistance the younger creatures managed to organize. But Sophia could feel possibility crackling in the air around her grandmother's pendant, like electricity before a storm. Power that belonged to her bloodline and her choice, and her willingness to step into an unknown future rather than accept the limited options that others had tried to impose on her since this whole supernatural adventure began. She pressed the ritual knife to her palm and let her blood fall onto the consecrated sand, while speaking words that came from somewhere deeper than memory, older than conscious knowledge, the true names of powers that predated kingdoms and compacts and every political structure that supernatural creatures had ever created, to organize their relationships with each other and the mortal world they had never stopped needing, despite centuries of pretending that independence was possible or desirable. The bonding ritual required more than blood and will. It demanded the complete surrender of everything Sophia had understood about the boundaries between human and supernatural existence, and as she pressed the ritual knife deeper into her palm, she felt power rising from the consecrated sand beneath her feet, like heat from forge fires that had burned since the world was young. Adrian's eyes held terror and wonder in equal measure as he watched her begin the transformation that would link their souls across eternity. But when she spoke the ancient words that would bind them together permanently, he stepped back with the kind of desperate panic that came from watching someone you love walk willingly into destruction. "Stop," he said, his voice breaking with emotion that 3 millennia of immortal existence had never prepared him to handle. "You don't understand what you're choosing. What immortality does to human souls over the centuries and decades and endless years that stretch ahead without the mercy of natural death to provide release from accumulated pain and loss, and the weight of watching everyone you care about crumble to dust while you remain unchanged and unchanging. I've seen mortals given the gift of vampire transformation and watched them go slowly mad from the isolation and the hunger and the terrible burden of outliving every connection that once made their existence meaningful. And I won't be responsible for destroying the very humanity that makes you capable of the love that's been healing parts of me I thought were permanently broken beyond any possibility of repair. But Sophia shook her head and continued speaking the ritual words that felt like coming home to a language she had always known but never been allowed to use. Power flowing through her bloodline like water through carefully tended channels, and she could feel her grandmother's presence surrounding her like blessing and benediction as the ancient compact revealed its true purpose. This isn't about becoming a vampire, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that belonged to magic older than kingdoms or territories, or any political structure that supernatural creatures had created to organize their relationships with the world around them. It's about becoming something new that honors both our natures instead of forcing us to choose between humanity and power, as if they were mutually exclusive, rather than complementary aspects of existence that were always meant to work together. The ancient vampires were pressing their attack through the chaos of supernatural combat, moving with predatory efficiency that spoke of eons spent perfecting the art of destruction, and Sophia could see that Cain was bleeding from wounds that weren't healing properly, while witches and werewolves fell back toward the arena's center in defensive formations that would collapse within minutes under the relentless assault of creatures who remembered when violence was pure and uncomplicated by treaties or moral considerations. Adrian looked toward Emma, who stood at the arena's edge with supernatural composure that belonged to her inherited bloodline rather than her 5 years of mortal experience. And Sophia saw the exact moment when his protective instincts overcame his fear of losing her to the transformation she was attempting. "If we do this," he said, his silver eyes reflecting millennia of hard-won wisdom and the kind of love that could survive any trial except separation, then the compact needs to be rewritten with protections for human families who carry magical bloodlines, safeguards against supernatural creatures who see mortals as prey rather than partners, and binding oaths that prevent the kind of manipulation that these ancient ones have used to turn our political differences into weapons for their own agenda. The ritual circle that formed around them as Sophia continued speaking the ancient words glowed with power that drew from every supernatural creature present. Werewolf pack bonds, and vampire blood magic, and witch spells all contributing energy to a working that was larger and more complex than any single species could have accomplished alone. But just as the transformation began to take hold, reality tilting, as Sophia felt her mortality starting to blur and merge with something vast and eternal, Marcus appeared through the chaos, with movements that spoke of desperate determination and the kind of fanatical purpose that belonged to creatures who had nothing left to lose. His golden beauty was ruined by wounds that weren't healing, his perfect features twisted by pain and the terrible understanding that he had been nothing but a puppet in someone else's larger game. But his eyes still burned with the fury of someone who refused to accept defeat, even when victory had become impossible. He moved toward Emma with vampire speed that was slowing but still faster than human reflexes could counter. His claws extended and his fangs bared in a final attempt to complete the mission that his ancient masters had given him regardless of the cost to his own existence or the innocents who would be destroyed in the process. Adrian intercepted the attack with movements that belonged more to human determination than supernatural grace, his increasingly mortal reflexes carrying him into the path of claws that could have carved through steel, and Sophia felt his pain like a physical blow as Marcus's strike opened wounds that his failing vampire healing couldn't close. The bonding ritual that had been building toward crescendo suddenly became desperate emergency surgery as Sophia found herself trying to complete the most complex magical working in supernatural history, while Adrian's life force drained away through injuries that would have been minor annoyances to a full vampire, but were fatal to someone caught between human and immortal existence. She could feel his memories flooding into her consciousness through the blood bond they were forming. 3,000 years of experience and accumulated wisdom, and the terrible loneliness that came from outliving civilizations and watching empires rise and fall while remaining fundamentally unchanged by the passage of time that transformed everything around him into dust and legend. At the same time, Adrian was experiencing every emotion she had ever suppressed, the fear and determination and love that had driven her to protect Emma at any cost, the grief for her grandmother, and the weight of family legacy that had shaped her understanding of responsibility and service to something larger than personal survival or happiness. Emma stepped into the ritual circle without hesitation, her small hands finding both their faces, while her inherited magical sensitivity provided the anchor that kept their souls from being torn apart by the intensity of complete psychic merger. And Sophia felt the child's courage and wisdom guiding them through a transformation that was unlike anything in supernatural history. The pain was indescribable, every nerve ending on fire while her consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives that belonged to immortal existence. But underneath the agony was something else, a sense of completion and rightness that spoke of powers finally being used as they were intended, rather than forced into shapes that distorted their true nature. When the transformation finished, they were still recognizably themselves, but fundamentally changed, sharing a single immortal existence that somehow contained both vampire strength and human compassion, without the weaknesses that had made each species vulnerable to corruption, or the kind of isolation that turned love into possession and protection into tyranny. The power that flowed between them was unlike anything the ancient vampires had expected, combining supernatural force with human creativity and moral flexibility in ways that made their rigid hierarchies and predator-prey assumptions suddenly obsolete. Sophia could feel every creature in the amphitheater through connections that belonged to her bloodline magic, understanding their fears and hopes and the complex web of relationships that bound supernatural communities together in networks of mutual dependence that transcended species boundaries. Adrian's millennia of political experience guided her use of these connections, showing her how to reach the parts of the ancient vampires' psyches that pure violence couldn't touch. The remnants of whatever they had been before power and isolation transformed them into something that could no longer remember why existence was worth preserving beyond the simple fact of survival. The battle that followed wasn't fought with claws and fangs, but with something deeper, a confrontation between different visions of what supernatural existence could become. And as the ancient vampires fell one by one, Sophia realized that they weren't dying but transforming, their rigid natures softening as they remembered connections and purposes they had abandoned centuries ago in favor of the harsh simplicity of predation. Marcus collapsed near the ritual circle, with wounds that his vampire healing couldn't address, his golden eyes losing their mad brilliance as whatever force had been driving him beyond reason finally released its hold on his will. He looked up at Sophia and Adrian with something that might have been recognition or relief, his voice barely audible over the sounds of supernatural creatures beginning to tend their wounded and process what they had witnessed. "I see it now," he whispered, blood flecking his lips as he spoke words that carried the weight of genuine understanding. What my rebellion was really meant to accomplish, why the Ancient Ones needed me to fail in exactly the way that would justify their return to power. They never intended for me to succeed because my victory would have created the same kind of rigid hierarchy they represented, just with different creatures in positions of authority. And what they really feared was exactly what you've become. Proof that evolution is possible. That we don't have to choose between power and compassion as if they were mutually exclusive rather than complementary aspects of existence. He closed his eyes with the peaceful expression of someone who had finally understood the shape of the maze he had been navigating blindly, and when he spoke again, his words carried the authority of deathbed confession and genuine repentance. "Forgive me for the innocents who died because of my pride, and the families who were destroyed, because I was too arrogant to recognize that I was being manipulated by forces older and more patient than any political ambition I could have conceived on my own, and use what we've learned here to build something better than the kingdoms we've inherited from creatures who never understood that true strength comes from connection rather than domination. The amphitheater fell silent as Marcus breathed his last supernatural creatures of every species, processing the implications of what they had witnessed, and the new reality that Sophia and Adrian's transformation had created. A future where the boundaries between human and immortal existence could be bridged by love rather than conquest, and where the ancient compact could be rewritten to protect the innocent while allowing supernatural creatures to evolve beyond the limitations that had defined them for millennia. The restaurant Sophia opened 6 months after the transformation occupied a converted brownstone in the heart of downtown, its warm amber lighting and exposed brick walls creating the kind of atmosphere that made both supernatural creatures and ordinary humans feel welcome without either group suspecting they were sharing space with beings whose existence challenged everything they thought they understood about the natural order. The menu featured dishes that drew inspiration from her grandmother's recipes, but adapted them for palates that didn't require magical intervention to appreciate complex flavors and carefully balanced nutrition. And the dining room filled nightly with an eclectic mix of customers that included werewolf pack leaders discussing territorial boundaries over perfectly grilled steaks and witch covens, celebrating seasonal festivals with elaborate vegetarian feasts that honored the earth magic they drew upon for their power. Adrian had insisted on providing the initial capital for the venture, though Sophia maintained complete creative control over everything from menu development to staff hiring to the subtle ward work that protected the establishment from supernatural creatures who might be tempted to use neutral territory for settling old grudges or conducting business that was better handled away from public scrutiny. Emma attended Crescent Academy, a boarding school nestled in the mountains, 3 hours north of the city, that specialized in educating children who carried supernatural heritage in their bloodlines, whether they had inherited werewolf strength, or vampire sensitivity, or witch magic, or stranger gifts that didn't fit neatly into established categories, but needed careful guidance to prevent accidental exposure of the hidden world that coexisted alongside ordinary human society. The Academy's faculty included reformed vampires who taught history from personal experience spanning multiple centuries, werewolf elders who instructed students in the delicate art of emotional control and pack dynamics, and witch scholars whose libraries contained knowledge that had been passed down through family lines since before the advent of written language. Emma thrived in this environment. Her natural diplomatic instincts and inherited magical sensitivity, making her a bridge between students who might otherwise have segregated themselves according to species lines. And Sophia felt pride mixed with bittersweet recognition that her daughter was already showing signs of the same gift for mediation that had characterized the Santos women for generations. The new treaties that Adrian negotiated in consultation with Sophia represented a fundamental shift in supernatural governance, moving away from the hierarchical structures that had defined vampire-dominated territories towards something more resembling the democratic councils that human societies had developed to balance competing interests without resorting to the kind of warfare that inevitably spilled over into civilian casualties. The diplomatic dinners held in Sophia's private dining room became legendary among supernatural circles, carefully orchestrated meals where werewolf alphas, who had been enemies for centuries, found themselves sharing stories about pack management, while vampire lords discovered they had more in common with witch matriarchs than their species' prejudices had ever allowed them to acknowledge. Sophia's role in these negotiations went far beyond providing exceptional cuisine. Her unique perspective as someone who bridged human and vampire nature, allowing her to understand the emotional undercurrents that drove supernatural politics and to suggest compromises that honored the legitimate concerns of all parties while preventing the kind of zero-sum thinking that had characterized supernatural diplomacy for millennia. The cookbook she published through a small press that specialized in ethnic and regional cuisines became an unexpected bestseller. Its carefully edited versions of Isabella Santos's traditional recipes presented as family heritage from a Mexican-American curandera, whose herbal knowledge represented generations of accumulated folk wisdom about nutrition and natural healing. Human readers appreciated the authentic flavors and the stories that accompanied each recipe. Tales of a grandmother who had raised her family through the Great Depression by growing medicinal herbs in window boxes and creating meals that could stretch limited ingredients into satisfying dinners that nourished both body and spirit. What they couldn't know was that every recipe had been carefully tested by supernatural creatures who understood the deeper properties of each ingredient combination, the way certain herbs could calm vampire bloodlust or help werewolves maintain human consciousness during their monthly transformations, or provide witch practitioners with the focused energy needed for complex spell work. The safe houses that Sophia and Adrian established in major cities across the continent provided sanctuary for humans whose bloodlines carried supernatural sensitivity, families who found themselves caught between worlds without understanding why their children showed unusual abilities, or why certain creatures seemed drawn to their neighborhoods like predators, following scent trails that led to sources of power they couldn't resist. These facilities operated under the cover of social service organizations that provided support for at-risk youth and families in crisis. Their staff trained to recognize the signs of emerging magical ability and equipped to provide protection and education that could prevent tragedy while helping young people understand and control gifts that could be dangerous without proper guidance. Emma's 13th birthday party was held in the restaurant's private dining room, a celebration that brought together classmates whose diversity would have seemed impossible to previous generations of supernatural creatures, werewolf cubs and vampire fledglings, and young witches whose magical education was proceeding alongside normal academic subjects in an environment that honored both their heritage and their need to function in the broader human world. The birthday girl herself had grown into a poised young woman who carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from understanding her place in a larger community. Her diplomatic skills already sophisticated enough that her teachers had begun consulting her when conflicts arose between students whose species prejudices created tension in classroom settings or dormitory arrangements. Sophia watched her daughter navigate conversations between a young werewolf who was struggling with anger management and a vampire teenager whose bloodlust was making it difficult to maintain friendships with mortal students. Emma's inherited sensitivity, allowing her to understand the emotional needs underlying both sets of behavioral problems, while her natural empathy helped her suggest solutions that addressed root causes rather than just managing symptoms. The Interspecies Youth Council that Emma had helped establish at Crescent Academy was already serving as a model for similar organizations in other supernatural communities, proving that the next generation was capable of cooperation and understanding that their parents had thought impossible when ancient prejudices and species rivalries had seemed like immutable facts of supernatural existence. Adrian's governance style had evolved to incorporate Sophia's insights about human psychology and social dynamics, his policies reflecting an understanding that sustainable rule required the consent of the governed rather than simple dominance backed by superior force. And the Eastern Territories had become a beacon of progressive supernatural administration that attracted refugees from regions where older vampires still maintained traditional hierarchies built on fear and absolute obedience. The transformation that had linked their souls continued to deepen their understanding of each other and the world around them. Adrian's millennia of experience providing historical context for contemporary problems, while Sophia's human perspective helped him recognize patterns and possibilities that immortal thinking might overlook, due to the kind of long-term focus that could miss opportunities for immediate improvement in favor of strategies that required decades or centuries to reach fruition. Their love had become something more complex and enduring than the passionate romance that had characterized their early relationship. A partnership built on mutual respect and complementary strengths that allowed them to face challenges that would have overwhelmed either of them individually. Years passed with the kind of steady contentment that characterized successful marriages in any species, marked by small daily rituals and shared responsibilities, rather than dramatic crises or supernatural emergencies, though Sophia never forgot that their happiness had been purchased at the cost of her mortality, and that the price of maintaining their transformed existence required constant attention to the balance between human compassion and immortal necessity. The restaurant continued to serve as neutral ground, where supernatural creatures could meet without the formal protocols that governed official diplomatic encounters, its warm atmosphere fostering the kind of casual interactions that built understanding and trust more effectively than any treaty negotiation could accomplish. And Sophia found deep satisfaction in knowing that her kitchen had become a place where former enemies could discover their common humanity, despite the species' differences that had once seemed insurmountable. On a quiet Thursday evening in early autumn, when the dining room was nearly empty and the last customers were lingering over dessert and coffee, an elderly woman entered carrying a young girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her dark hair braided with the kind of careful attention that spoke of loving hands and limited resources. The woman moved with the careful dignity of someone who had survived hardships that would have broken weaker spirits, her weathered face bearing the kind of lines that came from decades spent worrying about others rather than herself. And when she approached the hostess station, Sophia felt recognition spark along her nerve endings like electricity before a storm. The herbs that clung to the woman's clothing carried the same complex aromatic signatures that had characterized Isabella Santos's garden, combinations of plants that most people would consider incompatible, but that trained curanderas knew could work together to achieve effects that transcended simple botanical chemistry. The little girl possessed the same wide, dark eyes that Sophia remembered seeing in mirrors throughout her childhood, the kind of gentle awareness that suggested supernatural sensitivity waiting to emerge under proper guidance. And when the woman spoke her request for a quiet table where she could feed her granddaughter, her voice carried the musical accent that belonged to families whose Spanish had been shaped by indigenous languages that predated European colonization. Sophia approached their table personally, carrying samples of dishes that featured the herb combinations she suspected would resonate with their bloodline heritage. And when the woman's eyes widened with recognition and gratitude, she knew that her family hadn't been the only one tasked with bridging worlds through the ancient art of transformative cuisine. The conversation that followed was conducted in the careful code that supernatural families used when discussing sensitive topics in public spaces. Seemingly innocent questions about family recipes and cooking techniques that actually conveyed complex information about magical traditions and the challenges of maintaining ancient knowledge in a modern world that had no context for understanding the true power of properly prepared food. The woman's name was Carmen Delgado, and she had spent 40 years protecting her granddaughter Esperanza while searching for others who might understand the girl's emerging abilities and provide the kind of education that couldn't be found in ordinary schools or conventional magical communities that focused on spell work rather than the more subtle arts that worked through nourishment and healing rather than direct manipulation of supernatural forces. Sophia offered sanctuary and training, connections to the network of safe houses and educational resources that she and Adrian had spent years developing. And as Carmen's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude, she reflected on the profound truth that love and sacrifice had power to transform not just individual lives, but entire civilizations when enough people chose courage over safety and connection over isolation.